It's a pleasure to be here and to get to lead this very distinguished panel of economists that several of whom I've worked with in the past in various capacities. As you mentioned, we have Professor Olivier Blanchard, who used to be the chief economist of the International Monetary Fund and is now a senior fellow at the Peterson Institute for International Economics. It's also been recently announced that he will be will be helping to lead a commission on future economic challenges, which has been created by the French President Emmanuel Macron. Jason Furman, Professor Jason Furman, was chairman of President Obama's Council of Economic Advisors and deputy director of the National Economic Council. He's now a joint professor at the Kennedy School of Government in Harvard and the Harvard Economics Department. And Professor Eugene Kandel is the CEO of Startup Nation Central, but as many of you will know, was also the Prime Minister of Israel's former chief economic advisor and head of his National Council. We have not a lot of time and plenty of things to discuss. I want to quickly get to not only where we are now, where the global economy is now, but also how we think this next stage of the recession and hopefully recovery will take place in different parts of the world. We're then going to think a bit more long term about the policy implications of what's happened in the last few months and the structural changes that we might see both in the global economy, things that could particularly affect Israel if we see a change in global supply chains and an attitude change towards trade, but also potentially the long-term implications for policy. There are things that governments have done in the last few months that we would never have expected them to do, certainly not as quickly as they have. Support for wages, direct support for wages, for example, does that set up the case for long-term shifts in policy towards things like universal basic income? I know all three speakers have plenty to add on these topics, but Olivier, Professor Blanchard, I wonder if I could start with you just by posing the obvious question of, where do you think we are now if we think of how the COVID crisis has hit the global economy? But perhaps more important, where do you think we're heading in the next few months? In a sense, it's a harder stage. We had historic declines in economies, historic support for economies. Now we're entering something which is more of a gradual situation where more nuanced policy might be called for. How do you think we're doing?
Good morning, good afternoon. In short, I'm more optimistic than most. And the main reason is that I think the shock we've had is extremely different from any previous recession or even depression. It was basically policy induced. We did the right thing on health grounds, but it had enormous economic effects. I think that most of what we did can be undone fairly quickly. Not all of it, but much of it. And so my forecast, if you want, is I think the worst is clearly behind us. We went to the bottom of the hole and we're climbing slowly, although I think the rate of climbing will be fairly high in the next few months. So Q3 in particular is likely to be quite good. We will recover. At some stage, we will slow down and getting back to trend will be harder. But the initial phase will be a fairly quick recovery, is my guess, with clear political implications for the numbers which come out and the election in the US. Let me stop there.
Well, Jason, I know that you have an interest in the potential implications of the election and how that affects the US economy. But short term or medium term, do you agree with Olivier that if not quite a V-shaped recovery, still we could bounce back quite quickly?
Some are calling it a reverse check mark. I broadly agree with Olivier, but I think I'm going to nudge it in a little bit more pessimistic direction. Two ways you can grow. One is people can go back to their old jobs. Businesses that were shuttered can reopen. That type of growth can happen very, very quickly. And that's why you'll see fast growth in the third quarter. That's why you'll see tremendous job growth and the like. I think, though, underlying all of this, There will be parts of the economy that continue to be affected by the virus, whether it's travel or restaurants and the like. There also will be a lot of reallocation, companies that decided they don't need to rehire everyone, or a company that was already having troubles before this, say a department store that goes bankrupt as a result of it. So you might get halfway back very quickly, but then you'll still be halfway from where you started. In the United States, that would mean you're still, 10 million jobs in the hole, the equivalent of the financial crisis. And that next phase where you need to find jobs at new employers, maybe even worse, you need to find a job in a new industry, is a process that's never been very quick. And so I view that more as a slog. Don't expect us to get back to our per capita incomes that we had before the crisis until maybe 2023. Huge amount of uncertainty around that. But I think it could be many years before we even begin to get back to where we were before all of this.
A lot to unpick there, but Eugene Kandel, if you look at the Israel context, do you share this general view of the next few months, or do you think perhaps there's a bit more structural change that we're going to have to deal with in the medium term?
Well, Israel being an export economy, it's basically its recovery depends much less on its local market and much more on the recovery of United States and Europe, because that's where the main markets for our exports are. And there is some bad news if what Jason says is going to happen in the US. There are better news. I like Olivier's prospects better. But there is one other thing that there is sort of silver lining to this whole thing, is that what we pretty much know by now is that technology will be in much higher demand after the corona and during than it was before. And it happens that Israel has a whole bunch of technologies that are quite relevant. Has been strong in these technologies traditionally, and so there is some silver lining. So we may see if all these companies survive and become, and get ready to launch their sort of competitive offensive. I think there is going to be an interesting how these will develop. But overall, it all depends on the big markets, how they recover.
And obviously, there is a real question embedded in really what all of you have said, trying to assess how long the crisis will last in terms of its direct effect on activity. And Olivier, I wondered, when you think from the European standpoint, one thing that's been very clear, it's been the contrast between the European countries and the US in their attitude to maintaining employment. And by and large, we've seen countries across Europe act to limit the rise in measured unemployment in a way that the US largely hasn't. And we've seen a big difference in the two as a result. If there are some structural changes coming out of this, or a prolonged period of social distancing, where restaurants, for example, and other people-facing businesses really cannot function on the same business models that they had before, does that call in question? Does that make it difficult to sustain that response by governments? Does it start to look like the US response is better?
Good. I want briefly to go back to the first exchange, and I think the central issue is indeed the degree of reallocation that is going to be needed. And it's clear that there are two shocks. And the first one is the ones which are due to physical distancing. And, with some confidence, we can think that by the end of next year, this will be gone. There's no reason to think that restaurants will be dramatically different in 2022 than they were in 2019. Then there are the deeper changes that Eugene was referring to, which is what will happen to travel, what will happen to IT, what will happen to universities. And there are really two views. One is we basically will go back to something quite similar with some changes, but nothing major. And then there's another view, which is, well, the world will be a different place. Depending on what you think, then in the first case, you basically want to protect the businesses longer until the physical distancing constraints are gone, and then let the economy adjust when unemployment is lower. In the second case, you may want to start earlier. And that answers the question you just asked, which is, I think we have to move to something which was mostly focused on protection of firms, of workers, to something which allows for some reallocation, but in an environment in which unemployment is crazily high, whether it's measured unemployment or non-work, which is very high in Europe, and in which there is enormous uncertainty about the degree of reallocation. So I think we have to go slowly. But indeed, I think the next phase requires us to think about how do we go from these protective schemes to something better. And it seems to me here that Europe did better in the first, under the lockdown, was more successful in getting money to the right people and to the right firms than the US. And I think it is doing better in thinking about the next step as well.
I guess, Jason Furman, the US response was also very front-loaded, but very focused on getting money into bank accounts, but of poor households in particular, but not, or at least that was the result, but not on preserving jobs at any price. When you look to the next phase that Olivier is talking about, what are the risks in the US, I guess particularly around the election?
Yeah. So, the US fiscal response was huge. It's hard to compare across countries. It appears to be the largest of any country. One success of that, as you noted in the question you're asking, Stephanie, is that in the month of April, households actually saw their disposable personal incomes rise, even though there was massive job loss. And that's because of the transfers they got through unemployment insurance and through checks. I think it's a real open question as to whether the US system, where an employer can furlough you and then you get a check from the government, or the European system, where you continue to get a check from your employer and your employer gets a check from the government, as to which of those will be better in the long term. I think to a first approximation, they might be more similar than everyone thinks. If Macy's reopens its stores, it's going to call back the employees that it furloughed. It won't not reopen a store because it can't find the people that worked in that store and have to do a fresh new hiring process. So if you can reopen in the United States, I think you will bring your employees back. I think it gives you a little bit of an extra option on flexibility to handle the reallocation shock. The tricky thing over the next couple months is that everything I've just talked about that I think has been to some degree successful ends at the end of July. And Congress came together quickly for the first round. There's much more acrimony, much more polarization right now as people are talking about and debating re-upping that round. State and local governments are cutting, which is counterproductive to the overall the recovery. Unemployment insurance, I don't think should be extended exactly as it is, but I think if it comes to an end entirely, that would mean some downward pressure on the economy going into the fall. And for that reason alone, my guess is Republicans and Democrats will come together to agree on something. Another round.
Just to push back on your first point, we do have, so Bloomberg Economics combines about 30 independent economists doing research, but also the 100-odd reporters around the world covering the economy for Bloomberg. And I don't say that only to give a plug, but also to say that some of them in the US had actually pulled together some interesting data showing that it looks like about a third of the unemployment benefits that are due or have been applied for in the US over the last few months have not been paid yet, if you compare what the claims with what's actually been going out of the door of the IRS. So I guess that's one point back to you, that it's perhaps a less reliable way of getting money to people if you're not using the existing employer. Is that a fair point?
Yeah, it varies a lot from state to state. These are unemployment insurance in the United States is administered by the states. Many states drastically underfunded their systems. Many states deliberately put obstacles in place of workers collecting those benefits. And yes, so it's certainly behind. They'll give you the back benefits once you're in the system. I'm not saying that's ideal at all. So I think in some ways the US system, absolutely, I would agree with you, can be more disruptive for workers. The replacement rates in the US system, the fraction of your wages it pays, to date have been, for 2/3 of workers, more than 100%. So once you get on the system, you're getting more money, for better or for worse, than you are in the so-called European systems.
And Eugene Kandel, you're obviously been very focused on making sure that there isn't a permanent effect, particularly to startups, otherwise viable startups in Israel, and that's a concern of governments everywhere, and it's indeed one of the reasons to have the wage support as well as the other measures, is to try and keep viable companies in business. Do you think, as we come out of this, that we have avoided a sort of wave of bankruptcies, you know, as the support is perhaps removed, as the economy comes back, that there won't be that structural hit to otherwise viable companies, or is that still a risk?
Yeah, the issue with startups and the technology companies is a bit different than the rest of the economy, especially the startups, because they can actually work. Their businesses were not closed because they can all work at home. And so, you know, we're talking to a lot of companies. Some of them even increased their headcounts because the demand went up. But even those that didn't increase the headcount, they do have almost all workers working at home. So this was less of an issue. The problem with startups is that foreign investments, and in Israel, these are a very high percentage of investments in startups are coming from foreign investors. They basically dried out unless these foreign investors have presence in Israel, they have a permanent presence. And so that's the big issue of basically a liquidity constraint. And so some of the investors are trying to make their companies and their portfolio to either close, or because they can't support them anymore, or cut costs, which means layoffs. So the layoffs are driven by the liquidity crisis rather than the lockdowns. And so that is relatively easy to support. And unlike in the previous crisis, Israeli government has been very speedily reacting to that, unlike some other things that are a bit more problematic. But in this case, they were innovative, and the difference in Israel is that they didn't go through investing directly into funds, but rather either doing grants, increasing the number of grants that Israeli Innovation Authority is giving, or going through either institutional investors or banks incentivizing them to provide investments and loans together with professional investors in this field. In fact, I think that the interesting thing that differentiates between different countries' responses on the medical side and the economic side is to what extent they've been scared by the SARS in 2003 on the medical side, or the great financial crisis in 2008. And Israel, fortunately or unfortunately, was not scared by either one of them. So we came into this fairly easily and sort of just gotten the hang of it by basically going through the motions and then increasing the engagement. So this may explain some of the things that happened here.
Olivier, if we think about the sort of we've talked sort of about the micro impacts on the economy and the labor market. When you look at the sort of big picture views of say next year and the challenges that we might be facing, I see two sets of viewpoints. One says that actually we've had all this monetary support and indeed the fiscal support, which will ultimately end in inflation because you have this pent up ability spending that has not actually been able to be spent. The other view is that governments will mismanage the exit strategy and remove support too quickly, and that you will have far more job losses and failures next year than you're anticipating now. If you were thinking about your IMF World Economic Outlook, which risk were you going to focus most on? What are you What are you concerned about?
So I think you have to distinguish between, say, the next 18 months again, I mean, kind of until vaccine expected value and later. I'm not very worried about policy for the next 18 months. I think it will likely to be right, and the worries about that will not overwhelm the need to do what is needed on the fiscal side. In terms of how much will be needed, I think the big question which is going to be how much fiscal support on the demand side there's going to be a need for. And there are two forces. I think you mentioned one, which is thinking about the next few months. Pent-up demand is clearly going to be there. I mean, as Jason said, disposable income went up a lot and consumption didn't. So people are going to want to buy the cars that they didn't want to buy. At the same time, the big issue on the other side is precautionary saving, which is people at this stage are clearly traumatized and they are saving for precautionary reasons. They don't understand what's happening. When I tell them that I think things are going to get better, many people are absolutely not convinced. They think it could get much worse. So I think there's going to be a lot of precautionary saving, but it might disappear fairly quickly. I mean, if I look at the countries where lockdowns are gone and physical distancing is getting weaker, I see a lot more confidence about the future. Things turn around very quickly. So I don't know how much need there'll be for more fiscal help. I'm agnostic, but that has an implication, which is that we should be ready, or the government should be ready to do more fiscal help this year, next year, for sure, if it's needed. But maybe it's not, and therefore what you want to put in place is not something which commits yourself to spending a lot, such as green investment, which is something that I would love to see, but it's not the right tool. You need something which is much more nimble. That's going to be the challenge for the next, say, 18 months. After this, there are going to be issues about the level of debt, about the balance sheets of banks. We can discuss it in response to your question, or we can come back to it. I'll just stop there, and if you want to come back, come back.
I want to come back on the European angle to you, which is when you talk about fiscal support and the potential for having a capacity there. Obviously, people will be very interested in the shift in policy you've seen in Europe over the last couple of weeks. First, the proposal from the French and German heads of state, and then the follow-up from the Commission. You know, some have said that perhaps 2020 will be remembered, at least in Europe, not just for COVID, but also for a pretty historic move in the direction of more burden sharing in Europe. Do you share that view of the potential significance of that big support package, particularly the 750 billion?
Yes, I think it is significant. As you know, as always, it's a bit less than what some of the opponents have pushed. But the notion that there is mutualized borrowing and distribution, not according to capital shares or anything like this, but as a function of need, this is major progress. Now, I don't think that this will be ready in time to really fight COVID, and therefore we should think about the best way of using those funds. But I think it's a really important step, and not one which is going to be completely undone after the crisis. I think the notion that the EU budget can be much larger, that there can be borrowing at the EU level, and that what has to be spent can go to the countries which really need it, as opposed to according to some key. I think all this is there. I'm relatively optimistic that this will be one of the long-lasting effects of the crisis.
But just briefly on the, I mean, Chancellor Merkel has said she hopes that it will be in place in time to give out some of those grants starting the beginning of next year. You think that's optimistic?
I think by then the need for these grants will be less clear on aggregate demand arguments. And I'm not sure what the grants are going to be spent for. I'm hoping that some of it will go to green investment. But there's going to be a lot of give and take about where the money goes. And it's going to be messy, as always in Europe. But on that, again, something very, very positive.
Jason, I'd be interested in your, I guess, brief response to Europe. You know, we've had a long tradition of being disappointed by European leaders, and maybe the last 2 weeks was a bit different. But also on that point I raised with Olivier about the prospects of either inflation or, on the other side, of a premature withdrawal? I mean, you've talked a bit about that already for the US, but
yeah, just as a general matter on inflation, the risks are just very asymmetric. Markets are expecting around a 1% inflation rate in the United States and in Europe. If it's 3 percentage points below what the markets expect, which I think is perfectly possible in the huge deflationary environment we're in, that would be a disaster. A minus 2% inflation rate would be a deflationary spiral. On the other hand, if it's 3 percentage points above what the markets expect, which I also think is very possible, given all the pent-up demand that we have, given the large supply shock, then we have a 4% inflation rate. That's not a disaster. In fact, that might even be ideal because it means lower real interest rates, which help borrowing and home ownership, lower real wages, which helps employment, and deleveraging of debt. So I don't think inflation needs to be on anyone's worry list. I think deflation needs to be on people's worries lists. In terms of deficits, you can tell something about what people expect from Europe by the fact that Italy can right now borrow for 10 years at 1.4 percentage points. That's not solely on the basis of expectations about Italy. That's based on bond purchases by the ECB and an expectation of some form of mutual assistance if needed at some point in the future. And so, to some degree, you're already seeing markets function as if there was a greater degree of European level fiscal policy, European level mutual support than there actually is to date. And the policymakers are, to some degree, catching up with those market expectations and validating them. If they don't keep doing that catching up and keep doing that validating, then you could see much higher interest rates in some of the countries that, that left to their own devices, would have much less fiscal space, and that would create more of a problem for all of this. The final thing I'd say on fiscal policy is just like inflation, where I thought, -2 is perfectly plausible and +4 is perfectly plausible. There's a huge amount of uncertainty right now. And so making fiscal policy, as Olivier said, more nimble, one way to make it nimble is to build in explicit triggers into it. If the unemployment rate is above blank, if it's, above in the United States 7%, then you automatically get another round of assistance. The unemployment rate falls below that threshold, then that assistance is scaled down or that assistance stops. Building that in, I think, is especially important in countries that have political systems that are less than fully functional and that can't be counted on to do, the rational thing at every point in time in the future. Figure out the rational thing now, legislate it, and then what happens in fiscal policy will depend on what happens in the economy.
Alas, the description of political systems that are not entirely functional covers really quite a lot of countries at this point, but we should probably not list them. Olivier, you wanted to come in briefly.
I wanted to come on inflation. And it seems to me that the probability mass is exactly where Jason put it, which is it's low inflation, probably maybe even the risk of deflation. But I tried very hard to think about a scary scenario in which there would be high inflation, very high inflation, not the 3 or 4% that Jason had, but something much higher and much more worrisome. And I think it would take an unusual combination of things. And first, it would require the desirable rate for macro purposes to increase a lot. So that from a macro point of view, you needed 3 or 4% real rates or something like this, which I just don't see happening, but doesn't have zero probability. When this happened, then there would be two things happening. The first one is the central bank would be very reluctant to increase the rates because it would basically lead to a large loss on its balance sheet. And there would be enormous pressure from the government on the central bank to say, look, guys, we need to finance the debt. Please keep the interest rates low. And that's where the issue of fiscal dominance, as we call it, would come in. Given the way central banks are organized, in particular in Europe at this point, I think the risk of a very large increase in the required rate and fiscal dominance of the central bank is very small. But it's conceivable. But that's the only scenario in which I think this could be ending. This could end very badly. And therefore, I don't put zero probability. It's a scenario I can think about, but unlikely.
And I do want to bring in Eugene in a minute, but just to follow up very briefly on that with Jason, I mean, of course, you talk about likely increase in government debt across the developed world, and particularly Europe and the US as a result of this, including particularly countries like Italy, but really everywhere. Do you see that changing? Do you think they are right to see that if they are indeed just seeing this as a big step change in debt, but not fundamentally a risk to long-term sustainability?
Yeah, interest rate forecasts for the last 35 years have almost invariably been a forecast that interest rates were about to start rising. And for 35 years, interest rates have consistently fallen. My entire professional life has been within all of that. And so, when I see these people talking about higher interest rates, but then the market's not expecting those higher interest rates, I'm going to go with the people who have their money on the line rather than the people idly speculating that, this time interest rates are going to skyrocket. Now, I think this is a way that Olivier phrased it in a conversation with me, but since I have the microphone, I'll say it now, which is there's been a lot of discussion and debate about why interest rates were so low even before this crisis. It's gone under the heading of secular stagnation. And most of the candidate explanations for why they were low were things like low productivity growth, low demand for investment, high supply of savings, high inequality. All of those are probably more true today as a result of this crisis than they were a year ago. So the underlying structural forces that have made interest rates so low and fall so much over the last 35 years just seem to still be in place. So I wouldn't bet against the market in their complacency about interest rates not rising.
Well, that's a brilliant response, because you've also managed to steal what might have been Olivier's response. So I will move on to you now. But Eugene, I'm going to give the future to you, the longer term structural changes out of this that I know that you're particularly focused on. I mean, we've seen, I guess there's two different kinds of things that have happened, and we're going to have to talk about it very briefly. But there's potentially technological changes that we knew about being accelerated by this, but also policy shifts coming out of this which may last. And I'm thinking about more direct support for vulnerable or workers in an economy, or even potentially a universal basic income in some places. How do you see those? Do you think that we are going to see an acceleration to a new kind of world?
Well, it's interesting that you asking this question because Israel just raised its first ever 100-year bond during the pandemic, which was actually at 4.5%. I think it was a pretty good deal. So there is some future, at least that the investors see for us and for the world, because otherwise they wouldn't be doing that. I think that you can split this issue into two areas. One is the medium term, how we get ready for these pandemics in general. And Olivier mentioned the precautionary savings that people are making today just out of fear. I think that should be one part of prudent policy for governments, to actually, instead of doing all these demand enhancing measures when things are tough, creating some kind of precautionary savings that are mandatory would be a reasonably good idea, and then just opening them up when the macro event happens. As far as your longer term question, I think that it's clear that as most crises, this crisis also accelerated the tech transformation. And unlike the 30, 40 and before years ago, when we were basically replacing muscles with machines, the current technological change for perhaps 20 years or even more is replacing basically senses and brains with software. And software, as we all know, has this tendency to have incredibly high economies of scale, unlike the machines in the past. And so it's not inconceivable that the lower demand for labor that we're experiencing now can be translated into lower need for labor when what Olivier was talking about, if companies really change the way they work and create much leaner organizations, much more remotely connected organizations that would require a whole bunch of professions to either disappear or shrink. So if we have lower demand for labor, we can actually reach a point where we may have labor redundancy. So we may have excess labor as not as a bug, but as a feature of our economy. And if that happens, we're definitely going to have significant social unrest. We see that already, which will be translated to political and outside of politics. It will bring radicalism into politics and into our public discourse. And so it's some way we're going to have to deal with this. And that's where what you suggested, citizen wages, are going to come to play, because at some point you can't really, you may be able to tolerate a small number of homeless on the streets, but you cannot tolerate 5 or 10% of the population being homeless. So that's going to create need for citizens' wage, and then we are basically in a conundrum, because a citizen's wage requires higher taxation. High taxation means that you have to tax people who are increasingly movable because of technology, and the most highly paid people are technologists and people who are entrepreneurs. And as we've seen, these people are highly movable across countries. And so if you create very high or generous citizen wage, you have to raise taxes, people may leave, you may end up without an ability to actually provide that. And so that brings me to the need for tax harmonization, which even in the European Union, which is the most harmonized area that we can see today across countries, you do not see tax harmonization as an outcome. Maybe it'll change, but this circle that is created is really worrying.
And do you think there's a possibility, again, thinking a bit more about the sort of radical economic options that might open up? Olivier mentioned green investments. Do you think there is scope for tilting support for the economy in COVID towards investments in sustainable investments in the future, either when it comes to green issues or some of the changes that you're talking about, Eugene, making the transformation of the economy less painful for people? Just to come back to you, Eugene, first.
Yeah, this is very interesting, and it's actually broader than green, because it's anything that's impact, and there is a whole movement about sort of enhancing impact investments. The only problem is that in order to do really high, unless you just want to spend money, but if you want to do it in order to change the country or change the economy, you really need to have a deal flow of good and scalable projects. And there is an interesting paradox in our world. If you look at the people who are large investors, let's say pension funds and family offices, etc., there's an estimation by IFC that there is about $26 trillion that are ready to be invested in impact investments. At least that's what they declare. If you look at but they always say, well, we don't really have much deal flow to invest. And if you look where this deal flow starts, it starts with tiny organizations that are financed by philanthropy or supported by various foundations. And so there's a huge mismatch between these enormous amounts of money that are allegedly available for impact investments and the basically no money that even not the 1/10% that goes to actually generate the deal flow that will be available for them to invest in. So I think that there is a whole need for creating a flow, just like we see in the venture capital, to create a flow in impact venture capital that would have the startups, VC funds, angels, growth funds, private equity, and then these giant investors that can invest in large projects. And this has been lacking. We're trying to see how technology can be fit into this equation.
Olivier, how ready do you think are European governments? I mean, you talked about the Commission and the potential timing issues there, but European governments themselves, one here early on the crisis, we heard a lot of talk about how this will be an opportunity, you know, as businesses are supported, we can put strings on this money and say, well, you can only do environmentally good things, or you have to accelerate your move to carbon neutrality in order to get this money. And then in practice, the need to get money out of the door is sort of in conflict with that desire to have lots of elaborate conditionality and make it do lots of wonderful things in the future. How have European governments been able to tilt some of this lending in directions that are good for the future as well?
I think there's a limit to what governments can do without the correct pricing of carbon. I think the only solution is to have carbon pricing play a major role in leading private actors to do the right thing. Everything else is short of the mark. Now, whether this happens, unfortunately, as we know, this tends to have adverse distributional effects. And so long as we can't solve that, it's not going to happen on the scale we need. I think one of the major challenges post-crisis is indeed to get to something like carbon pricing plus a number of projects, but taking into account and repairing the distributional implications. Maybe it happens. Again, we're between hope and forecast here. My hope is that it happens and there'll be a bit more of a window to do it. The other thing which I think will happen and the pressure was there before the crisis, but I think it's going to be more intense given the need to refine tax revenues and the inequality again, is that we're going to see heavier corporate taxation. So I think that some of the agreements or potential agreements on the taxation of multinational firms and so on are more likely to take place after this COVID crisis than they were before. That would be good. But something like this, you know, even corporate taxation at the national level, I think is likely to be high.
Well, it's interesting that you say, Olivier, anything that depends on multinational agreement and governments coming together at the moment, people have been, it looks less likely in most other contexts, but maybe that's one area where it might happen. I mean, Jason, just to go on to that, obviously Israel and Europe greatly affected by what the global trading system looks like. There's been a great ratcheting up of rhetoric and indeed genuine source of geopolitical tension that isn't only due to President Trump coming in the relationship between the US and China. You know, have you changed your view of independent of who wins the election in the US, have you changed your view of what the global economy looks like over the next few years as a result of what we've seen in the last year or so?
Yeah, I mean, globalization is often treated by commentators like a very fragile plant because, and you've seen it in the course of your career, Stephanie, every few years people are proclaiming this is going to kill globalization, that is going to end globalization, this is the end of globalization. And yet somehow it continues to march on. Now, I'm certainly not thrilled with where we are right now. The best I could say is at least the United States hasn't yet withdrawn from the World Trade Organization, in addition to its withdrawal from the World Health Organization. I think that there's all sorts of legitimate issues with China, but there's a ton of illegitimate issues that are brought up with China, and a lot of illegitimate ways those issues are raised and dealt with. So I personally would believe in dealing on a multilateral basis with any challenges with China, dealing through the World Trade Organization. But You just look in the last few weeks, there have been a couple major American companies that have increased their investment in China and have located new investment in China. So there is a set of noise, a set of uncertainty on one side, and then there's a set of very, very powerful forces that the United States is 5% of the global population, 20% of global GDP. Those companies are going to want to operate around the world. They're going to want to sell around the world. They're going to want to locate around the world. Wages can often be lower. Production, integrated global supply chains have challenges, but they have enormous, enormous benefits. That's why we have so many of those global supply chains. So I think we're seeing some damage to globalization. I think we're seeing some slowdown of it. I'd like to see it handled very differently. But whatever the governments do, I think the economic forces are powerful enough that we will continue to have a high level of globalization, if not a rising level of globalization for some time to come.
I mean, I would say what you said about supply chains definitely fits with what some of my people are seeing on the ground in Asia, that there's a lot of talk about people unwinding their supply chains and distancing themselves from China, or at least diversifying. But on the ground, there has been so much commitment, as you suggested, by these major US companies that and they're looking at the possibilities for diversification in, say, Vietnam, and saying, well, you could put your factory in Vietnam, but then half of the inputs are still coming from China, so you're not necessarily gaining anything. So I think that's definitely true. But Eugene, I mean, it does seem, I'm interested to know what you think about the potential change in the global trading environment, because even if the economic forces favoring global supply chains are still there, if you move to a more bilateral situation on trade negotiations and trade relations, that's inevitably less good for small countries. So how does Israel fit in that?
Yeah, definitely challenging for small countries when two 800-pound gorillas arm wrestling. This is, you try to get, at least not get under their both fists. But I'm a bit less, I agree that globalization will remain high for a variety of reasons, but I think it will, one important thing that we have to remember, that I don't think that today US administration or another US administration can really look at the situation in which it's completely dependent on a variety of critical issues on other countries, China or not China, it doesn't really matter. And what this pandemic showed, and this was a relatively light case of pandemic, I mean, in terms of sort of closures, we're coming out of it in a few months, hopefully. There are much worse things that can happen. And so when another national government can just lock the border, or you locking the border because you cannot let anybody in because they just potentially can infect you, it creates huge dependencies on in the areas of pharmaceuticals, food, electronics, critical machinery, et cetera, et cetera. And so that in my opinion will lead to unwinding and making the supply chains still international, but much more local in terms of geographies. There will be, in my opinion, there will be much more trade, much closer to regionally, and less trade across the world. And because by accidentally, it will also be good for the green that we were talking about before, because there will be much less transportation, but it's still, and I think that the fact that we don't see that is because these things take a very long time, to plan a transfer, especially transfer from significant plant from one location to another, especially when your labor costs go up by 4 or 5 times, is a tricky situation. You want to employ or deploy all the available technology that you can. And so in our opinion, there's going to be a drastically increased demand for the Industry 4.0 companies and technologies that will help position. I also think that There will be benefits for example, for South America in terms of supply to Europe, for Eastern Europe, for supply to Western Europe. I think there will be much more of that, but we cannot expect that it will happen under COVID within 2 months. I mean, that'll take few years. I think it's going to be, in our opinion, it's going to be the major shift in terms of capital investments in the next, or the major driver of the capital investments in the next 5 years.
We should say that we are grateful to the French Minister Bruno Le Maire for giving us a little bit of extra time with his delay in reaching us, but it has given us a little bit more time to talk. Olivier, I wanted to just give you a chance to speak to this potential change in the global supply chains, but also particularly individual countries' attitude to globalization, because I was struck, I think it was a G20 meeting in Riyadh, which was one of the first ones to think about COVID in sort of late February. And Bruno Le Maire at that meeting was one who specifically immediately raised the issue of potentially bringing production of key goods back home as a result of this crisis. And at that point, we were just thinking of it as a shock, or he was perhaps just thinking of it as a shock from China, rather than this kind of global shock. But he said it was not a question of protectionism, it was a question of national, of economic sovereignty. Do you think in Europe you might see a bit more of this effort to turn inward in some areas?
Yeah, I mean, I think that COVID is reinforcing something, forces which were there before COVID and will be there after COVID. There's clearly a backlash against the distributional effects of globalization. And it was very clearly there that puts pressure on countries to try to keep things at home. There's the security issues which had come before COVID. There's now the geopolitical issues which make firms reluctant to go to a country which might get into a war of some sort with the US and so on. So I think we're going to see, I'm very much where Jason is. I don't think it's going to be a sea change, but we're going to see reorganization, shortening of supply chains, as Eugene mentioned, repatriation at home. You know, firms always have to basically deal with both profit and whether the government is on their side. As long as the governments were at least officially open to trade, integration, and so on, this, you know, you could concentrate on profit and globalize and organize. Now you basically know that the governments are going to put pressure on you to stay home. They're not on your side. So I think we're going to see some of that. Again, I don't think it's going to be dramatic because the benefits from globalization, from trade, are gigantic. People are not willing to pay 3 times what they were paying before for some things. But yeah, I think that that's going to lead to a slowdown, maybe a temporary stop in globalization.
And as Jason said, you can find that the supply chains are so complicated that it's almost impossible to unwind, because when you think you've nationalized one product, you realize when there's retaliation from the other country that actually you need the inputs for that product from that country. So it's too much, probably too intricately wound. We have some, I know Wendy Singer has fielded some excellent expert to get to now before we hear from the French minister. So I shall hand over to Wendy Singer now, but in the meantime, thank you very much to all the speakers.